When we think about misinformation today, we imagine Twitter posts, exaggerated headlines, and tabloids stuck in the aisles of Target. In fact, misinformation is not a modern problem, and it spans long before the age of digital media and the casual commercialization of gossip. One of the more memorable historical examples is the 1918 influenza pandemic, which is commonly referred to as the Spanish flu. To understand misinformation during this era, we first need to understand the context in which it occurred. The 1918 influenza pandemic emerged during the final year of World War I, a moment where governments were deeply invested in maintaining morale, controlling public narratives, and sustaining military recruitment. Information was shared in America, but it was heavily monitored and reviewed. As we've seen during times of all-encompassing global war, censorship was a policy to maintain positive public opinion of the government. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 meant that newspapers could be fined or shut down for publishing material deemed harmful to the war effort. Information about a new global disease, an event that suggested panic and instability, could not be allowed to be spread to the public. As a result, early reporting on influenza outbreaks was often vague, misleading, or reassuring. Newspapers described the illness as a case of 3-day fever, downplaying both its contagiousness and its lethality. Public officials echoed these claims, insisting that there was little cause for alarm. Even the U.S. Surgeon General at the time, Rupert Blue, claimed that there was no cause for alarm if proper precautions were observed. A case of blatant misinformation during the era was the origin of the name Spanish flu. In truth, Spain was not where the virus originated. In fact, the country was neutral during World War I and did not enforce the same wartime censorship as nations participating in combat. Spanish newspapers reported openly on outbreaks, including the illness of King Alfonso XIII. In the United States, censorship concerning the disease was so restrictive that the media hid the fact that the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, had come down with a case of the flu himself, contracted during the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Because Spain spoke openly while others stayed silent, the false impression emerged that Spain was uniquely affected. In reality, Spain was simply telling the truth. When information is suppressed in some places but shared in others, misinformation will surely fill in the gaps. Medical knowledge at the time further complicated the situation. Scientists had not yet identified viruses as we understand them today. Many physicians believed that influenza was caused by bacteria, particularly Haemophilus influenzae. Without a clear understanding of the disease's mechanism, public health guidance was inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. Many people used homemade remedies to protect themselves. Cities tried to urge more scientifically backed methods, but many, like masks and bans on public gatherings, were ridiculed in many places. Many tactics to protect citizens were enforced too late to make a meaningful difference. The scale of public misinformation during that time cannot be easily stated. Citizens had no one to trust but government officials, who repeatedly led them astray with stories that covered up and denied any problems. This reluctance to speak plainly had consequences. When the severity of the pandemic could no longer be hidden, the public's trust of the government disappeared. Medical knowledge at the time further complicated the situation. Scientists had not yet identified viruses as we understand them today. Many physicians believed that influenza was caused by bacteria, particularly Haemophilus influenzae. Without a clear understanding of the disease's mechanism, public health guidance was inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. The early 20th century was not as primitive as we imagine. The crux of the pandemic's deadliness was not simply scientific ignorance, but the refusal to communicate uncertainty honestly. Officials feared that admitting what they did not know would cause panic. Their attempt at confidence only led the country down a dark, dangerous path. Official reports during the pandemic rarely ever stated who was being disproportionately affected, such as working class communities, people of color, and indigenous populations. Because of this complete absence of information, public understanding of who was at risk was distorted. Mrs. Edna Register Boone, a 100-year-old resident of Mobile, Alabama, tells about her own personal experience, separate from the government's, about the 1918 flu outbreak.
County, Alabama. We moved away from the farm when I was 3 years old and moved into the little town of Madrid, still Houston County. Times were troubled, a war going on, the flu epidemic that followed the boll weevil, 3 catastrophes right there. A new disease, just like another epidemic would be, perhaps, maybe not the flu, but something else. And it would be a new disease. We would have to learn to deal with it.
The Spanish flu reminds us that misinformation does not require malice. It can arise from fear, political pressure, or the desire to appear competent, though the consequences can be deadly. If we can learn anything from the Spanish flu, it is that honest communication is not a luxury during a crisis. It is a public health intervention. As we study the suppression and censorship of information during the Spanish flu, we are not just looking backward. We are being asked to reflect on how we communicate risk and responsibility, and whether we are willing to tell the truth, even when it is the hardest thing we've done. Hello guys, I want to talk about my Gamma for a second, just to give a little context about what this video is about. I created my Gamma, which was making a newspaper, based on the confusion and speculation that would have been felt during the 1918 flu pandemic. While not a perfect recreation, I wanted to show what it would have been like to receive vague reassurances about the health of the country that may or may not have been true. None of the articles I wrote are explicitly true, but they are based on the stories I researched on the confusion and overall haze of the pandemic. Since all of us have collectively experienced a pandemic ourselves, I found it really interesting that some of our most recent ancestors have gone through a crisis that is really quite similar to ours, though we would have received information very differently. Thank you so much for watching.